It's 5 a.m. on a dark Monday morning in the middle of January, and the alarm's just gone off. You've told yourself that you're going to go out for that run before work. It's part of a new routine you're trying to form. You know you'll feel good, and you've even told your mates. But that bed right now is feeling cozy. It's dark and cold outside, and you're feeling warm. How do you think you're going to be reacting right now? Even if you're the kind of person who would leap out of bed full of energy and get it done, you'll acknowledge it takes some effort, right? Or you may be one of the vast majority of us that would hit that off button so hard and then say, yeah, okay, I'll do it tomorrow. Normally when I canvass people on this, almost everyone would hit the alarm. What would you do? So we know, of course, rationally that getting up would be a good answer. There's lots of research on the benefits of both exercise and an early start. If it was just down to what's rational, we'd simply get up and go without a second thought. The thing is, it's not. We're largely driven by our emotions, even if we'd like to think otherwise. How often in the past few weeks have you eaten more than you think you should? How often have you drunk more than you intended? Even been drunk more than you intended? Did you mean to exercise more? See, the hard truth is that our behaviours, more often than not, don't match up to our good intentions. And this is highly relevant to change, any kind of change, whether it's personal, professional, or on a global scale. A typical change at this time of year that we may recognise is the New Year's resolution. Were you brave enough to go there this year? Maybe you've tried giving up something for January. Well, I'm impressed if you have, given the circumstances. But most importantly, how is it working out? You may have noticed that New Year's resolutions, even in normal times, are pretty hard to stick to. Apparently 80% of resolutions fail within a few months. The gym membership subscription model, of course, relies on that fact. For those of you that are regular gym members, you'll know that the car parks are generally full in January. By the end of February, however, it's a very different story. So what's causing this gap between our intentions on the one hand and our behaviours on the other? Well, we have some unfortunate mental hardwiring that's working against us. It's the internal battle between our emotional side and our rational side. In other words, the one that wants to eat biscuits and drink wine in front of the telly versus the one that thinks we should eat greens and do press-ups. We actually have two parts of our brain that operate semi-independently: our limbic system and our frontal cortex. The limbic system is the older part of the brain, the animal brain if you will, and it's emotionally driven. It's designed actually to protect us from danger. The frontal cortex is the thinking part. It's where we rationalise. Steve Peters captures this well in the Chimp Paradox. It's well worth a read if you haven't already. But here's the thing. Apparently our emotional side, it's much faster and much stronger than our rational side. Something like 5 times in fact. And that's why we're mostly fighting a losing battle, unless we can tap into that emotional side. The headline is, if we're not emotionally engaged in something, we're not fully committed. And that means we'll either talk about it and do nothing, or we'll start and become distracted, then gradually lose interest. Does that sound familiar? So given that's happening within each of us, and that we each have our own internal battles going on, imagine that we're trying to get other people to change something, such as how they work, maybe to streamline a process or adopt a new system. Let's scale it up. Maybe you're trying to get a few hundred or a few thousand people to change. Given what we've just discussed, you'd think that would be pretty tough, right? And yet, there are situations where we do change, and we change at scale. Just to put this in perspective, this was March 2020. That's 1/3 of the global population in some form of lockdown. Now, I don't know about you, but that wasn't something I would choose, and I think most of us would agree. And yet we went there. On the other hand, there are some changes we struggle with, similar scale, similarly consequential to human life. And in this case, we've been battling with it for 50 years. So what is it that causes us to change in some cases and yet resist in others? Well, it starts with that recognition that change is, for the most part, an emotional process and something that happens inside each of us. In other words, it's an inside-out process, and therefore the key to unlocking change at scale is to start from that place. We love to think we're rational, and yet look at the big decisions we make in life. Houses, cars, holidays, even employing people. And you can even tell by the language we use. It just feels right. It's nice to drive. This place has good vibes. I get a good feeling about that person. How often have you caught yourself rationalizing a decision that you've in fact already made? So what does that mean in terms of change, and how do we apply it in practice? As you'd expect, there are lots of models out there, plenty of evidence-based research. The good news is that whilst they may all look different or use different language, they do at least point in similar directions. We've found that there's 5 key themes that tend to exist and are applicable for pretty much any type of change we're trying to make, whether it's as an individual or involving lots of people, whether it's at small scale, company-wide, or even global scale. These principles seem to hold true, but test them for yourself. Anyway, let's take a quick look at them. Have you ever had that strong emotional desire to do something different or to stop something? The feeling that's so strong you just can't ignore it. It's like an itch you have to scratch. It just keeps nagging at you and hijacking your thoughts. Maybe it's a hobby or an interest that fascinates you and that you enjoy so much you literally can't leave it alone. Perhaps a cause that's so close to your heart that you can't ignore it and you feel you just have to do something. Maybe you saw something that made you angry or upset to the point where you felt you had to act. I still remember how shocked I was watching the Blue Planet video with Sir David Attenborough many years ago. That strong emotional drive or motivation to change something and make the necessary sacrifices to do it is what we call energize. It's the fuel that powers change and creates momentum from a standing position. It's the forward motion that overcomes the natural inertia to stay as we are. Think of a rocket that needs fuel to overcome gravity and launch itself into orbit. It's a feeling so compelling we just can't ignore it. It may be that we've found something we want so much we can't think of anything else. Or it may be something about the way things are, where we literally say to ourselves, that's it, enough is enough. My grandparents were big smokers, typically 40 to 60 a day. And I remember my grandmother telling me that they suddenly looked at the ashtray and saw all the money they were literally burning away. And for what? To destroy their health. They gave up instantly. My grandfather put a box of cigarettes next to his armchair in a drawer and never touched them again. From 60 a day to 0, no therapy and no falling off the wagon. Because he felt emotionally driven. Literally, he'd had enough of that situation. Look at the civil rights movement in the 60s, led by Martin Luther King. People felt compelled to join in and empowered to feel part of something important. It drove loads of change. Clearly there are still problems today, but we've made huge progress since. And at the time, established norms were dismantled. It starts, of course, with us all seeing things in a similar way, which in general, we don't. We've heard recent discussions on Brexit. Brexit is terrible, Brexit is a great thing. You've been in those discussions, I'm sure. Trump is a great leader, or Trump is a terrible man who divided the nation. All have access to similar data, and yet they come to different conclusions. Our worldview is shaped by our values, our beliefs, what we choose to read, our culture, our social networks, even our parents to some extent. And it can be hard to see it in ourselves, but it is there. It's like we're all looking at the same world through a different lens or a different window. And of course we all think we're right. For Energize to work at scale, everyone, or at least a big enough majority, needs to see something in a similar way. In a work context, when fixing a process, for example, getting to a better solution is the easy bit. Most of us could quickly come up with something better. The hard bit is getting everyone to see the same problem in a similar way. That, of course, is the key to adoption. And actually, it's why so many IT projects fall short. They end up with being a solution where, at least in the minds of those involved, there was no problem, or at least no agreement on the nature of the problem. If we can't agree on the problem, then how can we possibly agree on the solution? At the beginning of the pandemic, everyone saw the need to stay at home to protect themselves and their loved ones. You may have noticed that this time round, compliance is more tricky because the energy to do this is starting to go out of the room. Part of the reason for that is what we'll look at next. Barriers. In other words, what's getting in the way of the change. So using the running analogy we started with, imagine for a minute that you'd forgotten to put your kit out and had to rummage around in the dark, trying not to wake everyone up. And then the dogs run off with your shoes. You can't find your head torch. Just before you're about to leave, it starts raining and it's heavy. These things are getting in the way of your good intentions. Of course, the advice is to get everything ready before you go to bed so you can just get up and go without thinking about it too much. The energy that you did have, if you managed to get out of bed, will begin to disappear very quickly if there are too many obstacles. In this case, you may be very tempted to just have a coffee, watch the news, or even just go back to bed and then try again tomorrow. Apparently, a vegan's worst nightmare is the dreaded bacon sandwich or hot dog, especially after a few beers when your guard's down. Dealing with these obstacles and having a plan for them is critical to making the most of your energy or motivation for the change that you've created. You don't want to waste that. It's like trying to drive with the handbrake on. Dealing with these obstacles or clearing the path is the second of our themes, which we call enable. Changing something, especially something important, involves an element of risk. A journey into the unknown. We're moving away from what's comfortable and familiar, or even uncomfortable and familiar. Better the devil you know, right? This uncertainty can cause us stress, and some of us are better at dealing with it than others. Some of us have a higher need to know what's ahead and a lower tolerance for uncertainty and risk. Whether change is exciting or scary has everything to do with how we individually process it. Take a look at this. In general, fear is a huge barrier. Fear of losing something important, looking silly, being ostracised, being fired even. Google ran a huge study on what makes a great team. A team that innovates well. From that study, they drew out 5 common themes. But you know, the most important of those themes was the absence of fear, what they call psychological safety. It was way more important than all of the others, and it was foundational. Nothing good happens when fear exists. And yet many organisations still operate on a culture of fear. And you'll notice if you look closely enough that true innovation rarely happens in that scenario. It's a biggie, so pay attention to it because it will disengage people really quickly if you don't. At a practical level, other barriers include cultural norms. This isn't the way things are done here is one we hear a lot, as you can imagine. Or so-and-so will never agree to that. Making changes that will undermine or affect things we like is another one. We know that cars, for example, are one of the biggest polluters, and yet you try getting us out of them, to stop using them and giving up the freedom that they give us. Imagine the effect on compliance to restrictions last year had there been no furlough scheme or other support for people and businesses. When you look carefully in any change situation, you'll see that there are obstacles or barriers everywhere. So it's always worth taking the time to find them and look for them and have strategies for them. Again, think of it as clearing the path so that the change and the energy you've created can move forward with greater ease. Enabling change. All good intentions are just that, an intention, until we actually start to take action. Of course, create a plan, do the preparation, but fundamentally start moving, step by step. The key to making any change is taking the first step, and then the next one, and the one after. Lots of small steps in time equal big changes. Staring at the top of a mountain won't get you up it, but taking one step at a time will eventually. We tend to focus more on what we haven't done than what we have. Sadly, we're hardwired in so many ways to focus on the negative, and that's a whole other topic area. So we need to counteract that by consciously focusing on and even celebrating the small wins that we have made. If we don't, then there's a real danger we'll lose momentum and undermine all of that great energy we've created. Rather unsurprisingly, we call this execute. This is the bit where we take the big ideas and we make them real. It's often messy and doesn't go as expected. We may need to change course. Hopefully we'll learn as we go. Once we and those around us start to see momentum, then it has a profound effect on our belief that things can change. One of our team uses the example of a project where everyone had moaned for years that the printer was so far away, it meant that most of the people had to use it had to go up and down stairs. And it took a lot of time out of the day. Good for their Fitbit, but not their productivity as it happens. Eventually they moved the photocopier. That in turn was symbolic and created a belief that things can change. And that in turn empowered those involved to make other changes. Whatever you do, do something. Actions speak louder than words. These sayings all exist for a reason. Another saying, which I'll attribute to Robin Sharma, as that's where I read it, is what gets scheduled gets done. Put another way, if we don't specifically make time for it, then why are we surprised at the end of the week when it hasn't happened? We all do it all the time. So the key is to be aware of it. You'll no doubt have seen this before. Execute. Turning our ideas into action. Or put another way, the tangible steps needed to make it happen. You may have noticed that it's one thing making a change. It's quite another making it stick. We discussed New Year's resolutions earlier, and all too often they get as far as February at best. Then we just fall back into old habits. And it happens at home and at work. Want to know why that is? Because we're habit machines, apparently. Studies have shown that roughly 80% of what we do is habit-based. It's actually an energy-saving device for our brains. Apparently, when we do something often enough, our brains eventually create little automated subroutines that can operate at a different level of consciousness, and therefore use less energy. How many times have you driven and can't remember part of the journey? You're making a coffee whilst thinking about what you're going to do next. The bad news is that these habits can undermine what we're trying to change. The good news, though, is if you can understand how they work, we can interrupt them and have them working for us and not against us. For any change to stick, we need to create these new habits, a process we call embedding. To coin a popular phrase at the moment, it's the process of establishing a new normal. Apparently, studies have shown that many corporate changes, having had millions spent on them, have gradually fallen back to the point where 3 years later, it's difficult to see much evidence they actually happened at all. This is especially true where the CEO or other influential figures have moved on. When changing things at work, especially new IT systems or processes, it takes time for things to bed in and for people to become comfortable. Apparently, to form a habit, we have to repeatedly do the task somewhere between 30 and 150 days. Depending on the nature of it. For a while it's going to feel strange and even uncomfortable, and it'll probably take longer to do the task, like when we first learned to drive. So we need to give people time to adjust to that. My colleague Martin and I ran a project for a client that included a whole new system for a customer services team. For various reasons, largely that we've discussed already, they were hugely resistant and hated it when it first went live, and probably us a little bit too. They felt comfortable with the old system because they'd used it for 25 years. Around 6 months later, we worked with them again and all met for a meal. Well, frankly, you'd have thought we were long-lost relatives. They were hugely complimentary about us both and massive fans, advocates even of the new system. And all that had happened was the passage of time. The passage of time did what it needed to in this case, and they got past their discomfort, only to realise that this was so much better for them. Plenty of lessons for us in that one at the time. Habits are things we do subconsciously without being aware of them, and can either work for or against us. If you'd like to know more, I can highly recommend The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. Last but definitely not least, and considering everything that's been said so far, there is one more critical thing. We can't take our eye off the ball, even for a second. In case you haven't noticed, the world changes quite a lot. Our personal situation changes, our motivation changes, business changes, politics changes. When we're changing something, it doesn't happen in a bubble. It exists within a context. So it's critical whether the changes in ourselves or at work that we keep our eyes open and stay aware. Aware of ourselves and our own feelings, aware of those around us and what they might be feeling, aware of what's happening in our company in general or in our industry. We call that evaluating. How many IT projects have you been involved in that by the time they were delivered, they were either irrelevant or at the very least definitely worth less to the company than they cost? That's assuming they didn't get stopped halfway through, and many do. In terms of those involved in the change or affected by it, their world may have changed too. At the moment, many more people will be likely fearful for their jobs than, say, in 2019. So they may react differently. The motivation for change may have reduced because of other things have taken higher priority. So it's important to check in regularly with those involved and affected by the change so that you can make adjustments if needed to keep the change both relevant and functioning well. So one last thing to pull all this together. I'll share with you an example from my world. My stepson's living with us at the moment. He's 22 and has recently become a committed vegan. I mean, to the point where the rest of us are starting to feel guilty going near an egg, never mind a lamb shank. He sends videos to my partner and me explaining, often in gory and shocking detail, why we should be vegan. Which of course the first thing we do is refuse to watch the videos. I'm 54 and I've seen many of them before, to be fair, and at least something similar. I get the rational case completely. I'm actually very interested in health and fitness in general, and I read a lot on both sides of the argument. And honestly, from what I've seen, there appears to be very little justification for health, animal welfare, or the environment to continue eating meat and dairy. And yet, I continue to eat meat and dairy. Alright, maybe less than I used to. But nevertheless, I like cheese. I like chocolate, the real stuff. I like the odd piece of chicken, pork or lamb. I like eggs. Even though I know rationally I should probably change, I'm feeling resistant to it. So I thought I'd test myself against those 5 themes that we've discussed just to see what's happening. Here's what I found. So as you can see, the lowest scores here are energize and enable. So that tells me that firstly, fundamentally I don't want this, at least emotionally. I may buy it rationally, but I'm not fully sold. In other words, I'm not really feeling it. I don't have that visceral reaction, that compelling drive that Mark has to do something different. Secondly, the things stopping me are quite high, for me at least. My second lowest score on is enable. And I've considered what I'd have to give up, and in my emotional head at least, it's just not worth it. So unless or until those things become different, this change, for me at least, isn't going to go anywhere. You can find a copy of the Change Readiness Assessment on our website if you're interested and would like to have a go. So a few things to take away. Firstly, change is an inside-out process. When it comes down to it, we all decide for ourselves. Second, all changes have certain characteristics in common, and once we start to understand them, it gets easier. And lastly, change is about people. And that's good news, right? Because we are all, after all, people. So that means we're actually really well qualified to know what's likely to work, or at least what to avoid in those around us. Thank you.